Dave the Potter, Artist, Poet, Slave by Laban Carrick Hill. Dave the Potter. To us, it is just dirt, the ground we walk on. Scoop up a handful. The gritty grains slip between your fingers. On wet days, heavy with rainwater, it is cool and squishy, mud pie heaven. But to Dave, it was clay, the plain and basic stuff upon which he learned to form a life as a slave nearly 200 years ago. To us, it is just a pot, round and tall, good for keeping marbles or fresh cut flowers. But to Dave, it was a pot large enough to store a season's grain harvest, to put up salted meats, to hold memories. Each one began out of clouds of dust, clotted clumps of clay, ground in the pug mill and carried, wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow, to Dave's spinning potter's wheel. With a flat wooden paddle large enough to row across the Atlantic, Dave mixed clay with water, drawn from Big Horse Creek, until wet and stiff and heavy. He threw the clay, sometimes 60 pounds at once, and nobody knew how or where it would land, except for Dave. Like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Dave kicked his potter's wheel until it spun as fast as a carnival's wheel of fortune. As you can see, this is done very neatly with pages that fold out, showing us the potter's wheel and Dave's hands buried in a mounded mud, pulled out the shape of a jar. His chapped thumbs, pinched into the center, squeezed the inside against his finger outside. As the wheel spun round and round, the walls of the jar rose up like a robin's puffed breast, but only so far before its immense weight threatened collapse. The jar grew so large Dave could no longer wrap his strong arms around it. If he climbed into the jar and curled into a ball, he would have embraced. Only then did he stop his potter's wheel and roll long ropes of clay between his dry, caked palms. Dave mounted these coils of clay one by one on the half-finished jar. He ran his wet fingers along the sides to smooth it all together, kicking the wheel with the heel of his foot. The shoulder and rim shrugged upward as the jar took the shape Dave knew was there, even before he worked the raw mound on his wheel. While the clay dried, Dave pounded wood, ash, and sand to mix a glass-like brown glaze to withstand time. But before the jar completely hardened, Dave picked up a stick and wrote to let us know that he was here. I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all and every nation. And here it is, written in cursive. I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all and every nation. August 16th, 1857, Dave. Five works by Dave the Potter in this photograph here. Dave, a life. I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all and every nation. Dave is an important American artist. His beautifully crafted jars stand out among the pottery of the time. His whimsical poems embodied a simplicity and deep emotional complexity that rivals Japanese haiku. These are remarkable accomplishments in themselves, but for Dave, who lived most of his life as a slave, they are even more incredible. We have printed his poems here as they appeared on the pots, including mistakes, as well as various marks such as dashes and plus signs. As Leonard Todd states in Carolina Clay, with so few words surviving from this gifted and unusual person, almost alone in his role of slave witness, it's important for us to get them right. Dave created his art in spite of a society that not only discouraged his brilliance but threatened him with death for expressing it. We know about Dave mainly because of what he wrote on his pottery. For long periods of time, Dave did not write on the sides of his pots, perhaps because he knew it was not safe. He would sometimes just sign his name. He only had a first name because slaves were not allowed to have family names like Hill or Collier. Other times he might put the date. Once in a while he would include a poem. Perhaps he wrote his poems for a specific person, or maybe for just anyone who could read. Put every bit all between. Surely this jar will hold 14. July 12th, 1834. This poem was written on one of the earliest pots that we know for certain Dave made. It tells us that the pot can hold 14 gallons. Dave was one of only two known potters at the time who could successfully make pots that were larger than 20 gallons, sometimes as large as 40 gallons. To do this, he had to wrestle more than 60 pounds of clay on his turning wheel, a feat that required great skill and strength. Dave belongs to Mr. Miles, where the oven bakes and the pot boils. July 31st, 1840. Some of what we know about Dave is buried in the shadows of the lives of his owners. The first record of Dave dates to his 17th year. His name appeared on a contract to borrow money to buy a house. Because his age is mentioned, we know that he was born sometime around 1801. We also learn that he was born in the United States, but we don't know where. A better thing I never saw when I shot off the lion's jaw. We can suppose that Dave lived a life much better than that of most slaves who worked in the fields. As a potter, he had a skill few black people were allowed to learn. Slaves were generally used for unskilled jobs. White slave owners feared that if their slaves learned skills such as blacksmithing or pottery, they might demand freedom and respect. For the same reason, slaves were not allowed to learn to read or write. How Dave learned may never be known. Another trick is worse than this. Dearest Miss, spare me a kiss. August 26, 1840. According to Leonard Todd, Dave lost his leg when he was around 35 years old. After that, his friend Henry, whose arms were crippled, kicked the potter's wheel for him. The details of the story in this book are taken from Dave's life before and after he lost his leg, but the focus is on Dave as a potter and poet with this in mind. The facts surrounding Dave's lost leg were not included. When you fill this jar with pork or beef, Scott will be there to get a piece. April 21st, 1848. We do know that some of Dave's poems leave a smile, while others offer observations on his life. The sun, moon, and stars in the west are a plenty of bears. July 29th, 1858. Over the years, Dave's poems shared the pain of losing his family as well as his love for others. His words expressed his humanity, his compassion, and his own passion for life. According to Jill Bowe Coverman in I Made This Jar, it is estimated that over 7 decades, Dave made approximately 40,000 pots, but it is only through these few surviving poems that we get to know him. The last surviving jar inscribed with a poem is dated May 3rd, 1862. This poem is a fitting epiphany for Dave. I made this jar all of cross. If you don't repent, you will be lost. Author's note. In 2003, I attended a conference on the Middle Passage organized by Dr. Laurie Smith at St. Michael's College in Vermont. Toward the end of the day, I wandered into a talk being given by Dr. Lisa Gale Collins, a professor of art at Vassar College. Her presentation was on African influences as African American art. At one point during the talk, she showed an image of a pot with a poem written on it. She was very briefly described the pot, read the poem, I made this jar olive cross. If you don't repent, you will be lost. And explained that an African American slave named Dave made the pot. I left that conference with Dave's poem resonating in my head. For a year, I thought about Dave and his poem. One evening, while watching PBS Antiques Roadshow, a pot made by Dave appeared. As the antiques dealer described the value of the pot, I began to think more about Dave's poems. As I began to research Dave online, I discovered that there had been an exhibition of Dave's pots at the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina in 1998. The McKissick had published an exhibition catalog. Jill Bowe Governor, a graduate student in the art history, had curated the show and collected in the an exhibition catalog all the material known about Dave. At this point, I began to write my own poem to celebrate Dave's life and art. This picture book is an expression of my great admiration for and awe of Dave as an artist, a poet, and a potter. Illustrator's note: during my research for this book, I learned that the enslaved potter named Dave had lived in an area just outside Edgefield, South Carolina, Pottersville. And so I made my way down to South Carolina to see for myself the ground that Dave walked on. Once in Edgefield, I was directed to the studio of a local potter named Stephen Farrell. Mr. Farrell explained to me that Dave the Potter is a central figure in the rich history of pottery made in the Carolinas. He then proceeded to throw a pot before my very eyes. He also showed me an authentic jar, signed and dated by Dave, that was displayed in his studio. The watercolor collage images for this book depict Dave engaged in the step-by-step process of creating pottery, from extracting the clay from the earth to grinding, kneading, and preparing the clay for the wheel, to applying the ash glaze. Finally, Dave handwrites a poetic verse on the outside of the jar, adding the date and his signature. Because there are no known visual references showing what Dave actually looked like, I based my illustrations on a model who I felt reflected the spirit of Dave. Throughout this book, certain images remind the reader that Dave was a slave, images of shackles and chains, and of slaves picking cotton in the fields. In many ways, Dave's artistry may have served as his own glimpse of freedom and a way of carving out a life under the brutal and dehumanizing conditions of slavery. Dave's noble and verses blaze through the ages and speak profoundly of dignity to our generation and beyond.